This video is a paid commission. If you want me to make a specific video for money, we can negotiate cost in DMs on Twitter or Discord or something. This one costed the requester $50, and the request was to explain what I've been doing online in the time since the end of the Procrastinators podcast, which I estimate was around summer of 2020. Now, when I talk about myself unscripted, I tend to ramble on and on for hours, and the video becomes totally inaccessible, or worse yet, I run out of recording space on my camera, which happened on my first attempt before I even made it to the year 2020 itself in my explanation. For that reason, I'm reading this video from a script through which I will hopefully have simplified 4 incredibly busy years worth of my life into something digestible. I will also be adding small comments into the script, which is on screen if you haven't noticed, and putting some images on screen in places to help center you in the era of content, or just mostly I'm just going to put thumbnails of the stuff I'm talking about on the screen. The Procrastinators podcast did not die in a straightforward manner, but more like slowly bled dry as each member lost interest in being a part of it anymore. As of spring 2020, I had outstanding projects with Endless Jess, given that we had recorded a whole 3rd season of The Plebe and the Weeb immediately after RadCon 4, and also with Best Guy Ever Nate, who was planning to move down to Virginia Beach not only because he was living in a total shithole in Cincinnati, and also wanted the opportunity to work with my cinematographer brother Victor more easily, but also because we had the idea to make Cantent, a show which would be our attempt at a half in the bag or a hack the movies for weeaboos. Otherwise, I wasn't involved in anything that the other PCP members had been doing aside from editing RadCon 4 footage, I guess, which gradually made it harder for me to really participate in the podcast because a lot of the show revolved around talking about the projects that everyone had going on outside of the show, and most of mine were completely self-involved and were not interesting to anybody else on the podcast. I started my gender transition in April of 2020, hugely inspired by the intense dysphoria that I experienced all throughout RadCon 4, especially because we did this whole bit where we did drag in swimsuits, and I felt the most unhealthy and broken I had ever felt at the time. I committed to intensive weight loss and image transformation after this, trying to build a sense of comfort with myself and sorting out the differences in how I wanted to present myself while being a public figure every single day was incredibly daunting. I spent a lot of time helping my ex-partner to also try and build her own internet presence, and through her live stream show, I started to develop a closer relationship to my core audience and to better understand the relationship that people had developed with our content and its ever-shifting focus. Probably the most important thing to understand about my mentality around this time, and what has affected me the most going forward from this period, is the realization that I am a woman who is incapable of giving birth to a child. There are many more women who are incapable of giving birth than most people understand. Some statistics say like a 1/6. And a lot of us share an immense set of insecurities over that subject, differently depending on why we can't have them. Mine are also tied up in the fact that I could have passed on my genes theoretically before getting too deep into hormone replacement therapy, and when I was still in a relationship with a woman, I was trying to decide if I was going to put some of my sperm on ice before I got onto HRT, since I didn't think we were ready for children yet, but I wanted them eventually, and trying to decide if it was worth $1,000 was tormenting me quite a bit, and it kept me postponing the actual start of the HRT process. It was only after my ex-partner left at the end of September 2020 and I found myself with a male partner in October that I ended up committing to HRT and started it in January of 2021. And also committed to the idea that if I am going to have a child, it might be impossible that they will have a genetic connection to me directly. Now, had I not been in a relationship with a woman whom I knew wanted to have children that shared our genes, I likely wouldn't have struggled so much with this quandary because I'm comfortable with the idea of adopting. Regardlessly, I think I would have come to that conclusion that whatever child I am to be a mother to will in some sense be adopted. I was coming to terms with that even before the end of my last relationship, and I was trying to find a way to explore my desire to express my motherly instinct responsibly in a time before I thought that we would be ready to actually raise young children, whether they were ours or adopted. This feeling is what led me to starting the Befriending the Internet podcast series, and I started vlogging and streaming more often, replying to more of my comments, and trying to have a more direct effect on the people that were within my sphere of influence. And that felt good sometimes, but I also quickly realized that I'm not really good enough at communicating, especially through the proxy of the internet, to really work with people in a way that doesn't lead to undue frustration, either on my part or theirs. This had been the whole theory behind RadCon in the first place, too, was that we didn't get that much done talking to each other on the internet, so we felt we could do a lot more if we got together in person. And that had worked out really well when we met at BronyCon and the first time we did a RadCon on our own expense. But when we started tying up a lot of money and promises into RadCon, it turned numbers 2 through 4 into massive fucking expensive headaches that weren't really very fun for me at all. I've always had a great time hanging out with creative people that I meet from the internet and making something in the spur of the moment because of the vibe that we're all sharing in, but trying to force it is almost always, in my experience, a huge mistake. In the recent first episode of my Fix Trixie show, I kept emphasizing that I have a difficult time getting excited about something by myself, and I feed off of others' excitement towards doing something. I have always tried to involve everyone that I know into my work. Usually they don't want to. And I tended to do things myself mostly because of the difficulty I had in finding anyone whose interests align well enough with mine about what to do. My friends from high school didn't like making content with me, and I slowly drifted away from them in the early years of my career and into friendships with people from the internet that I got to meet in person once or twice, like the members of the PCP. When I started living with my ex, we did as much content together as possible, and I had collabs all the time with people from the internet, none of which almost ever got nearly as popular as the content that I would make by myself, but it was generally more fun for me to create. It might be fair to say that the number one issue I've faced over the last decade of making videos is that I get the best results on a career level when I shut everyone out and do everything by myself. But I have no enthusiasm towards doing that, and I will prefer every time to make something less popular if it will be fun to do with someone that I want to do a thing with. All of that is tremendously important to understanding why my first encounter with Riley and Mint Salad of Antisocial Entertainment had so much impact on my life. When I met them, Mint Salad was, practically speaking, a mute artist, and Riley was a maniacal troll who could not stop talking. Also importantly, they were both runaway foster kids from abusive households, and both of them had practically taught themselves how to be people by listening to The Dick Show and its parent podcast, The Biggest Problem in the Universe, which I had also been tremendously inspired and influenced by, and also a part of the community. We all knew about one another because of the fact that we had all appeared on the show in some fashion. But it was only after meeting them in person that I felt like I had suddenly found my adult children, or at the very least, a new sibling and their partner, whichever one makes more sense to consider which. I'm sure they think it's funny to be just considered incest siblings because of this. Riley was operating under the motto, meet people, make stuff, which is exactly where I was at in life, and the fact that he could rap almost as well as I could and had some of the same taste was hugely important as well. We made the Burning Down the Barns at the Karen Farm song within 24 hours of meeting, at the tail end of a very long acid come down, having driven to Richmond to have lunch with Ethan Ralph for the first time earlier that day, and recorded our first fully on acid podcast together even earlier that morning. In the course of all of this, I had devised our plan to buy an RV with which we could take tours around the country to work with various artists and do a show about how they make their stuff. Kind of like Manben, the show where Naoki Urasawa interviews other manga artists, but for internet creators all over the US. Riley and Mint had already been going across the country meeting people like this anyways. They had left their driver, Bird, at home on this round, but he would join them on managing a hip-hop tour through the Midwest only a week after they visited my house, starting from all of their home base in Twin Falls, Idaho. I realize that all of this sounds kind of insane when I say it out loud, but a lot of that comes down to a level of experience and expectation. At this point, I know that the only really unreasonable part of all of this idea Was my expectation that I could buy not just an RV, but a large enough RV to house all... I wrote 4 here, but it was originally all 5 of us comfortably and manage responsibly. The other, the asinine part was thinking that my ex-partner was actually going to stick around for this. At the time, I had about 22 grand in the bank, but I spent like 3 of that and did not make it back just in the time between meeting Riley and moving him, Mint and Bird, into my house a month later. Largely because of shenanigans of a flailing relationship nearing the end of its life. It was only about a month after everyone moved into my house that my ex-partner left me to have a child with Ethan Ralph. Mind you, we all met him for the first time literally 2 months before that. And all of the drama of that period is too dense to decompress here, so you'd have to revisit the content from that period to really try to parse your way through it. During that first month of them living here, I had gotten close with Bird Stork, whom I learned in that time was not only the best home cook I've ever met, but also capable of driving endless distances, and also seemed to be attracted to me, and vice versa, albeit he was also clearly terrified to overstep any boundaries with me as the owner of a place he was staying at for free. We developed a relationship soon after my last one ended, and since I'd basically lost track of where my life was supposed to be going after 3.5 years of building towards a future with someone that I had no future with anymore, I became more interested in what my new friends had going on and how I could be involved with that than I was with trying to involve them more in my own shit, which I had mostly lost interest in by this point. Riley had already planned out a couple of cross-country trips that the 3 of them would have been taking regardless of whether I'd been involved or not, but I put myself into those trips and spent a lot of money to make them really fun for all of us along the way. Around Halloween, we took a cross-country drive to the California desert for Burning Dick, a fan meetup made to replace Burning Man on a year that didn't happen, which went kind of middlingly. We met tons of people, stayed in a lot of hotels, and had a lot of drama, some of all that being compiled into the first Void Chasers documentary. Somewhere around this time is when I delisted all of my pre-transition content from YouTube, trying to create a clear disconnect between my current identity and the way that I was seen in the past. Doing this not only pissed off a lot of my audience, I should say all of my audience, but changing the channel name to Yig Studio and delisting all of the popular content put a permanent black mark on this channel algorithmically that I truly did not comprehend at the time, or I wouldn't have done it. No one thought it was a good idea. I did not warn anyone before announcing it, nor before pulling the trigger early, but I was very, very angry at the time. This is what led to the death of Cantent. Nate expressed a lack of interest in working with someone so volatile, especially when I was planning to start traveling even more significantly and might not be easily available to keep making videos. The channel had gotten a little bit successful, but it wasn't showing any real signs of growth, and not making enough money to really be worth the effort we were putting in unless it was going to grow a lot more, and Nate saw me making that only more difficult. Meanwhile, we had both mostly stopped going on the Procrastinators show, and over the course of 2020, Ben Saint had become deeply embittered to my desire to shelve the Brony lecture that I had filmed at RadCon, and realized actually wasn't very good when I was editing it. He took increasingly and bizarrely extreme measures to try and bully me into finishing it, leading me out of talking to him or anyone that kept associating with him at all, and eventually escalating to full-on beef, which pretty much put a nail in the coffin of the podcast. In between the various week-long cross-country trips that we were taking every other month and the bi-weekly drives to buy cheap wax in Washington, D.C., Riley and I collaborated on creating a lot of music, and we also got a ways into a bunch of different things that never saw completion. I planned out multiple animated shows, and Mint even did a whole 7 minutes of preliminary animation based on my storyboard, comprising the first episode of my Bargain Witch story, but we kept finding ourselves shifting gears to try and keep money coming in when our fun projects were mostly just pissing people off. Mint was driving for DoorDash, Riley was still heavily involved in the Dick Show and resistant to emerging as a full public figure himself, and Bird wanted to do something creative, but he didn't have any strong ideas, so he let us try to build shows out of his cooking or force him into making music with mixed results, and spent most of his time playing Borderlands 3. I kept writing anime videos in between my other creative projects, but nothing was really landing or pulling in new viewers, and I was making less and less money month over month, while the travel ate through what I had in the bank till the last drop. As soon as the lease on my house was up, we had to be out of it because I would not be able to afford the rent for another month, and this was April 2021. When we left my house, we left nearly all of my stuff in a storage unit in Virginia Beach. I sold my car, and we all functionally began life in Bird's Prius on a cross-country drive to his family reunion, which would be happening a week later. We had a half-assed plan to house hunt on our way across the country, but by the time we made it to our first stop at Butthole Weeb's house in Indiana, it had become clear that there was nothing we could realistically afford almost anywhere. Bird got worried that we would spend too much money staying in hotels across the country, so we stayed at Landon's house a few more days with the intent of blasting across the rest of the country in a 2-day manic burst. Tensions rose in the house because we were out of weed and we couldn't buy it in Indiana, which made Riley want to hit the road, while Bird was fine getting drunk with Landon and sleeping all day in his incredibly quiet house. Now, Riley doesn't drink and is uncomfortable around drunk people, and eventually the two of them got into a big blowout fight that nearly ended their working relationship entirely. Bird and I made the most insane cross-country drive we ever have, and Riley and Mint were picked up by Riley's grandma. I don't know why I said their grandma. She's not fucking Mint's grandma. Riley's grandma from Arkansas, leading to the Summer Series 2021 vlogs, and then they got a place with producer Cranberry Dave, Cranberry Dave had come to the house a couple of times, actually. I think first in like December and then in January, and he was there when the Ethan Ralph break-in happened. That's why he's in that video. He is a beat composer, producer who had been a longtime fan of mine, so, we just hung out with them and ended up becoming friends and working with them. And he was trying to move to Corbin to get a cheap apartment in the hopes of buying a cheap house because he had a ton of money saved up, and he was going to flip that house. But he never ended up actually doing this. So, they got this little apartment, and that was where they first started in Corbin. So Bert and I made it all the way to California. And at and surrounding the family reunion, I met the majority of Bird's very large family. And then we moved into the guest room of my parents' house in Huntington Beach, California, which is about an hour south of Los Angeles, so like 2 hours north of where all of Bird's family lives. For a long time, I had been considering my fallback plan that if I lost everything else I had, I would hole up in my parents' house and just keep writing until I had a great novel. And so I went at trying to finally make that happen while Bird got a job working for the mall installation of a taco truck in Inglewood. I spent most of this summer in my mom's garage smoking weed with her, watching Jack's Films videos with Bird, and trying to create the best stuff that I could in my own time. But I kept finding that I was still very much struggling with identifying what message I was trying to put forward in my work. I mean, consider I had taken like 3 months of hormones, couldn't get back on them in California because I didn't have insurance, and Planned Parenthood wouldn't work with me, and I couldn't get insurance unless I became a state resident, and I didn't know if we were going to stay in California for very long. There was just a lot going on with me personally that was making it, getting in the way of me getting anything done. I wrote the best first 2 chapters of an unfinished book that I ever have written, but then I hit a snag and couldn't figure out how to continue it, so I started gear shifting again. Now, before the band had broken up, Riley had already organized that I was going to perform as the opener for a pair of shows in Elko, Nevada, which is one of the places we had visited on one of our trips so that he could MC a couple of shows there. And we ended up, when we were there the first time, interviewing most of the rappers in town, as well as OG rappers Spice One. I ended up, later on, opening for Twisted... I ended up on, I think, my birthday, or maybe it was the week before that. On one of those weeks was my birthday, so this was in August. I opened for a Twisted Insane show and for a Stevie Stone show that had Twistello as the secret headliner. And Twistello was whom Riley, Mint, and Bird had toured with just before they moved in with me. They were managing his tour, like running his merch and stuff. And he has been one of the biggest influences on my understanding of how and why to perform live hip hop. I learned a lot doing these shows, but mostly that if I was going to do more live shows, I really needed to reorient my material because most of it up to that point is about seething in a bedroom. You would be shocked how long I spent toiling through my discography trying to find 5 songs that not only did I know the words to, but also would be good to perform live. I wrote rap moments about my experiences in Elko the first time so I could perform it at my first show, and even that only went okay as a crowd song. So, yeah, since then I've been pretty focused on if I'm going to make songs, I want them to sound a lot better live. Be something you can listen to with other people and not only by yourself cringing in a bedroom. Another important revelation from this period is the reality of car camping, which I had never been aware of in my life until this point. My idea of camping came from being a Cub Scout in the 4th and 5th grade and just totally hating and dissociating through most of summer camp. When Bird and I arrived at the state park on the California beach where the family reunion happened, and we learned that camping can mean paying $20 to pitch your tent directly outside of your car in a really gorgeous version of a parking lot, it quickly became one of my favorite activities imaginable, especially amenable to my other hobbies of drinking, smoking, doing drugs, eating steak and cheeseburgers, and listening to music. Day trips that we would later take to Crystal Cove State Park and especially our one-night stay at Sequoia National Park inspired a new and tremendously less expensive mentality towards travel with me, and also a lot of the lyrics on my Perfect Rapper LP, whose good songs are now collected on my Rescues and Rarities release. Because I was quickly humbled to the idea that I could write a classic novel or put on a great hip-hop show, I decided instead to flex my ability to make the best possible anime analysis videos, and from that came the idea for Anime Alphabet. In concept, every show that I talk about in that series is a classic of some importance with a timeless need to be discussed, and I would approach them as thoroughly and with as much perspective as it was possible for me to gather as an American that doesn't speak that much Japanese. I wanted to especially favor shows that were influential in the US and were popular with my generation of anime fans. Another important thing that I've put off talking about is how I touched on a relationship with Screenwave, which is now called Retroware, the company that owns the Angry Video Game Nerd, and how this gave me a unique perspective on where I could have been as a YouTuber had I not made all the terrible moves that I did from like 2018 through 2020. Meeting the core staff of AVGN's Empire was incidental to the fact that Riley and Mint were guests on Hack the Movies, and then Riley, Bird, and I were on a Rare Talkin' About Tapes, these all run by Tony from Hack the Movies, very famous YouTuber, and were filmed inside of what was then the Screenwave studio. During this time, Riley had talked to the producers at the studio in the context of trying to produce my content and to form a relationship with them, and it was made clear to him in no uncertain terms that if my channel was pulling 50,000 views per video, they would be eager to work with me. Now this fell pretty dramatically on my ears, knowing that I used to easily make 50,000 views per video and could have been working with these guys as their anime division probably several years, like maybe, if I'd known about them or investigated this 2 years earlier, I would have definitely become a brand, a part of their brand. But I had more than fucked that up in the years since then. And everybody was kind of looking at me like, can you build it back? Like, prove you can build it back. Prove you can concentrate and build one thing for a while. And people were happy with Anime Alphabet conceptually. It just didn't start pulling in those views. But I'll talk about this as I've written it here. This is why I set the explicit goal in every Anime Alphabet video that they would receive a bespoke sequel after hitting 50,000 views. A few of them now have reached their goals, and so I would still like to produce those sequels, but it's important to note that it took years for all of those videos to grow, and I had already given up and retired a year later after starting this series, by the time the first one hit its goal, like 2 or 3 years later. I created the first 3 episodes of Anime Alphabet while I was living with my parents, and I wrote the Digimon Adventure script there, but then my dad ended up kicking us out of the house over paranoia that we would get them all COVID because we didn't want to get the vaccine. We had both already had COVID, had antibodies. Bird was really concerned about health risks possible from being a tall boy. Eventually, my dad would end up being convinced, like a year later, by RF fucking K that the vaccine was a scam. So, whatever you think, it's irrelevant to the fact that my dad fucking up and kicking us out of the house costed everyone thousands of dollars. Because I couldn't complete the facial hair removal that he had already fully paid for my birthday, and I only did 2 sessions of. And I spent a lot of money on bullshit to make it through the next year. Frankly, we could not have afforded living in Huntington Beach much longer anyways because everything is crazy expensive there, and we weren't even getting close to finding a place to move or really saving any money. So, we started the Picnic Adventure series by filming our adventure across the country in November 2021 when we left my parents' house, stopping at a bunch of national parks and at houses of friends on our way to my Uncle Johnny's place in Yorktown, Virginia, on the other side of the country. Now, my Uncle Johnny was going to let us stay for free, but he is a raging alcoholic who constantly ate up our time with his nonsense and got us involved in fights with his crazy wife that he can't decide if he's divorcing or not. I can't even begin to get into trying to talk about that. It would take all night. Ironically, while Bird was working a fast food job and I was doing my work at home while Johnny was at work for most of the day, was the happiest the two of us have ever been with our jobs. Bird liked his job. I was getting out content consistently. I was enjoying making it. I was slowly building towards getting views again. But I also faced the issue that almost every time one of my videos started taking off, it would get struck down by copyright issues, from my Spy Family video to my Mushoku Tensei video, and I kept losing heart in the idea of being a YouTuber by myself and struggling with this slow climb possibly to nowhere. We also lived in a totally disconnected neighborhood. I never had the car, so I was kind of just at home with no friends and nowhere really to go, just making these videos by myself. Meanwhile, Johnny and his wife continued making life aggravating and difficult, and meanwhile, Riley and Mint had started up a Fansly account maybe 3 months into when we were living with Johnny, and they started making more money every month than any of us had ever made up until that point. So they were like, we want to bring y'all in, because the only problem they were having is communication breakdowns. They would get into arguments about the job, and then the job wouldn't get done, and so they'd make less money. So they were hoping we could help them to resolve these issues and basically manage Mint's career so that Riley wouldn't have to. He was thinking, if the problem is that I'm going to end up fighting with you, try doing it with one of these people. So he was hoping to bring us into the fold, and we would all be able to keep her Fansly going and making a lot of money. So ultimately, Riley offered for us to come live at their place for free instead of at my uncle's, and to pay us monthly for helping to manage and collaborate with Mint. It's worth noting that we had met with Riley and Mint for the first time since the breakup on our way back across the country when we stopped in at the apartment that they had with Dave in Corbin, Kentucky. And then we visited them again, I think 3 months later, when we all went to our first Too Many Games convention, which is run by Retroware Studio. And when we went to their house before going to that, I think is when we recorded Hurricane Season, and then Dave mixed it while we were at the convention. And at that con, Bird and I became engaged. We met AVGN and his band and a bunch of other creators. And between that Too Many Games, which had been delayed into November because of COVID, and the next one that was only 6 months later in 2022, Riley, Mint, and Dave had rented a whole house. So we moved in with them immediately after all of us went to Too Many Games together in 2022. And this was the one where we met Vivzy, Brandon Rogers, and Adam Nalen, as well as the Nostalgia Critic. So just to get the timeline clear again, we moved in with my Uncle Johnny in September 2021. We moved out like right at the start, I believe, of June 2022, immediately after the second Too Many Games that we went to with Riley and Mint. And we went straight from there to Riley and Mint's house. Riley and Johnny got into a fight on the way out that ensured I would not talk to Johnny. Well, then he started sending me drunk texts that assured I would never talk to that motherfucker again until he cleans himself up. But the first couple months of us living in Corbin were a total chaos of ideas. Bird quickly realized he had no idea how to manage the situation, and he started spending most of his time watching Netflix and sleeping. Riley and I were trying to stay invested in making hip-hop together, launching our Sucker Punch Group project with Cranberry Dave's production at the center, while also guiding Mint's production of daily movie reviews as advertisement for her Fansly, which she posted daily content on top of bespoke commissions. While none of this content individually was all that difficult to create, managing all of it on top of one another would prove more than especially Mint could handle, and she would prove more than any of us could handle, while we were also trying to involve other people in all of this madness. We moved in rapper friend Dyron Miller from Houston in the second month out of concern that his granddad was going to make him join the military or kick him out. But after a month of difficulties with communicating and dealing with the tensions in the house, he ended up moving back home, and most of the wind went out of working on Sucker Punch for all of us. During all of that, I was trying desperately to breathe life into my channel, and so I spent all of August making daily content, tackling every subject that I or Riley could find to try and snag on some sort of hype wave while I was collabing on Mint's content. I kept building up to the idea that something big was going to happen at the end of the month, which was originally going to be me replacing my 250 plus anime recommendations video with over 400 recommendations instead. Over the course of the month, as the stress of failing vlogs kept building, someone floated the suggestion that the big announcement be my retirement instead, and that I just became a part of Mint Salad's crew. Now again, I remind you that I struggle to get excited about things by myself, and I prefer to work on someone else's thing when I can, so I jumped on this suggestion. And the mental fallout of realizing that I couldn't in good confidence recommend as many anime as I had purported that I would in my last video left me feeling ready to leave anime content behind for a long while and try something else. So at the end of August 2022, I retired from considering my YouTube channel as the center point of my career and from making anime content for a while. Now, when I started working with Mint, it quickly became apparent that I didn't have much to contribute, and moreover, the more personally responsible I had to be for her behavior, the less tolerable I found that behavior in turn. I quickly retreated into doing more of my own thing and really trying to get experimental, creating test accounts with new identities and making truly weird stuff that I didn't tell anybody about, like the first Media Melt magazine, which I only revealed publicly more than a year and a half later on a random livestream, or my Baby Stabbers short story, my Stealing Dan mixtape, and the Traveling Cemetery album. Bird and I also spent a lot of time just wandering the streets of Corbin, Kentucky, and really exploring every single corner of the city and having long talks all throughout the day, trying to align our perspectives and deepen our relationship, because up to that point we hadn't really spent that much time diving into our thoughts about our circumstances and our expectations for the future together. It was clear to both of us at that point that our favorite things to do were to travel, camp, and see amazing places, watch funny and cute and badass movies and videos, and visit people that we like all around the country, especially to eat delicious food, drink great booze, and try fun drugs. I didn't want to give up on being a creative for a living, but I also wasn't having any ideas for more content that would definitely make money, and my only income was a couple $100 I was still being paid by some very kind or maybe forgetful patrons who never canceled even when I said I wasn't making anything at all. Bird and I took lots of camping trips. We discovered lots of free places to camp and every place worth visiting in southern Kentucky, but we didn't have a lot of money to make anything happen, and we would sometimes just spend weeks just sort of bumming around the house trying to come up with what we were going to do next. Towards the end of 2022, I spent a couple of months working towards establishing Bird's internet presence by creating the Bird Friends Play channel for edited Let's Plays, and also frequently streaming us just walking around and having adventures on the Picnic Adventure channel. I edited and released a lot of the footage that we had gathered over the previous year in this time, and we recorded a whole Let's Play of Dark Souls 3, which I only edited and released very little of before I started burning out on having been editing for like a solid month and a half at that point. Then I wrote like 50 pages about Shantae over this one weekend when Bird was out of town for work. So, another detail I've left out until now because it's hard to explain is Bird's on and off bank merchandising job. Our mutual friend John, who is a longtime friend of Riley's, had conscripted Bird into this job when he came to visit our place back in January 2021 in Virginia Beach. And basically, every few weekends, he would come through town and scoop up Bird to take him somewhere to remodel a bank, sometimes as far as 9 hours away. See, John and his boss are headquartered in Chicago, but they take contracts anywhere in the U.S. that they can afford to put an employee. And so there are people all over the country who get calls every so often about job offers in their relative vicinity to do a weekend of work with a pretty high turnover. Bird had done some of this work when we lived in Virginia, and then more of it as a weekend gig when we lived in California, but the work that he would get was rare and inconsistent, especially when we lived anywhere without a high density of banks and with a low density of other employees working there. Towards the end of 2022, Bird had started working this job again when we were living in Kentucky, and on one trip with John and another coworker that they took to Virginia Beach, he had a near-death experience passing out shit-faced in a bathtub with the water running while he was on a video call with me. I was able to get a hold of John, who got the hotel staff into the locked bathroom to save him, and this made Bird realize that he could not travel far from home from me like this because he is prone to that sort of behavior without me. So, in early 2023, Bird convinced me to start working the merchandising job along with him and John, starting with a trip that took us for one weekend to San Antonio, Austin, and Dallas, Texas, at the end of which I got to meet Bad Eater finally, who also produces a lot of mine and Riley's music. And then John went back home, and me and Bird drove straight to Redding, California in our second worst manic driving burst, where I met the boss and became an official employee. We then visited our friend Kayshawn in Twin Falls on the way home, whom I'd originally only gotten to meet on our first cross-country trip with the whole gang before then. Our next job in March flew us out to California to... Our next job wasn't until March, so we basically subsisted off the money from that first job until then. And that one flew us out to California to drive all over the state, checking to see if different banks had this one specific metal sign, and if it was there, to remove it. That was it for a week. So then that job subsisted us until the next one, which had us going through Tennessee, Texas, and all the states in between, measuring bank windows for like 2 weeks. And on the way back from that trip is when we discovered a deep love for Oklahoma, especially Sulphur, Chickasaw, and Oklahoma City. Now after that trip, there was like a month and a half long gap before we would have more work. But we had been assured that our work would be consistent for at least 6 months, and it would take us all over the country, starting in April, as long as we trained to install vinyl lettering onto bank windows. And so we did. Now, between the job that had taken us to Texas and the vinyl job, we found ourselves one day watching anime, namely Dead Mount Deathplay and Hell's Paradise, and our desire to talk about those shows led to starting the We Watch Anime podcast and channel. Now, my thinking at the time was mostly that if we could make a consistent anime podcast over the course of our time while we were doing our main job, it might be successful enough that by the end of 6 months, it could help us coast on our income between the times that we didn't have work. Our main goal at that point was just saving up to buy a house, although we also continued debating if we'd rather get a trailer or something mobile or get a truck first, or any number of other solutions that we never got decisive enough on to make a real effort at saving money towards that, instead of just having as much fun as possible along the way. Now, starting from that April was when we entered a state of almost constant travel for the rest of the entire year, almost never stepping back to Corbin, Kentucky. So I have to note at this point, when we moved in with Johnny, we had taken all of my stuff out of storage and put it all in Johnny's shed. And then when we moved in with Riley, we took everything out of Johnny's house and moved it into Riley's house / shed. So most of my stuff is still in Riley's house / shed. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's in Victor's attic, and then a bunch of stuff that I have now moved from Riley's house to my parents' house. And my stuff is now split across 3 different places. Bird still has a bunch of stuff that's still in Twin Falls with his friend Kayshawn, and the rest of his stuff is either at Riley's place or here. So both of us basically live all over the country in some fashion. So during this period, we really truly broke away from being really anywhere and just kind of lived in whatever hotel we were put up in for that period of time. We spent a few days in Chicago, going up there for 2 different trips, and then we went to Sioux City, and then we spent a couple of weeks driving around Kansas City, then a couple of weeks driving around St. Louis, a couple of weeks driving around Tulsa, a little bit of time in Springfield, Oklahoma City. And during all that time, we met with various fans. We developed a complicated friendship, which at times was either the best or the worst reason to consider moving to Kansas City, on top of falling in love with the city as our favorite Midwestern city that has fully legal weed. Oklahoma City only has medical. And in that time, we also built up a deep love for the Midwest. But in all that time that we were building up this deep love for the Midwest, we then had all that ripped away in this ridiculously short-term long-distance drive, the third worst, this time all the way to Portland, Oregon, where we spent about a month living in our boss's wife's bizarre mountainside mansion with 6 rented-out rooms up a hill in Portland. I hated living in this place. Now, parts of our time driving around Oregon were really cool, but we got pretty emotionally drained around this point in the journey, and we were having a hard time creating time for We Watch Anime between all of our travel, all the headaches created by the job, spending most of our afternoons in breweries, always being tired when we got home. I was pretty over it. I had kind of wanted us to quit the job and just stay in Kansas City because I thought by that point, we had been spending most of the money we were making, and we only had $4,000 to fuck around with, and I didn't see us having more at the end of the job because I didn't see us not continuing to fuck around. So, that's pretty much exactly what happened. We made it to the end of this gig, and we were pretty much right back where we started, but we did have an amazing time at most of it, other than the month in Portland. That first month in Portland was really exhausting. It really sucked. Then we spent 2 weeks in Olympia, Washington, and another 2 weeks in Seattle next, which were much better. We met more friends, we drank more drinks, and we continued flailing on our podcast. And then around the end of August, we were finally at the end of our originally planned 4-month work excursion without an exact idea of where to go next. And this led to a pivotal return visit to Kansas City. We spent about a week house hunting there, and we came very close to renting an apartment. But then we camped for a weekend at the end of that, and we realized that if we continued doing our traveling job, not only would we rarely be home, but we probably would want to go camping most of the time that we had off anyways, so having a place wouldn't really be worth paying for. Bird wasn't ready to move into a place on the promise of trying to work harder at the We Watch Anime show either, because it hadn't really been that financially successful so far, and there was no reason to think that we would make enough to afford a place by the end of the next month. Plus, we had managed to spend practically all of the money we'd been making along the way just having too much fun. We got a week of work in Kansas City and then an offer to spend a couple of months working slightly more sporadically as long as we were willing to return to Oregon and California, and so we did. This time we spent almost 2 months doing circles around Oregon and a little bit of Northern California, camping wherever we could get to on every gap between work. Although it was winter time, so it was very cold camping. It wasn't easy, but we got to see Yosemite, we got to see Yellowstone, we got to see Crater Lake, beautiful places. At one point, we had a 2.5-week gap between jobs in November when we got to travel down from Northern California to Southern California, where our next part of the job would be. And so we camped in a bunch of the hottest parts of the country. We camped in like Death Valley and stuff because in the wintertime, those places are actually very pleasant and was much nicer than, all the northern camping we'd done. And that 2.5 weeks where we were just traveling like every day to a new thing, like a couple of hours away from the last thing in the desert, occasionally stopping at smoking room Motel 6s to do podcasts. That was like the most fun, least stressful stretch of my life possibly ever. Sadly, this was followed up by being stuck in LA for the next month, dealing with constant traffic and job headaches, up until the end of the year when there was another abrupt gap in work for at least the next month with no promises in sight about future employment. Now, in the meantime of us doing this travel job, my parents had sold their house in Huntington Beach and moved back to Norfolk, Virginia at the end of our tour, Bird's dad was also moving from San Diego to Pennsylvania on the other side of the country. Now, Bird's grandparents had offered for us to stay at their place and babysit their dogs for the 2 weeks that they would spend driving across country in a caravan with his dad's family. And during that time is when we decided, and of course we took her up on that offer and we watched the dogs and had a great time. And during that 2 weeks is when we decided that we would move back to Virginia for sure, stay with my parents again, Bird would return to normal employment, and I would return to trying to make money on the internet, at least until it was successful, and if not, just get a regular job. And that's when I wrote the 24 consecutive anime scripts for the sake of having a pocket full of anime content that I could return with. So, after the time we spent at his grandparents' house, which we extended a bit even after they were back just to hang out with them for a while longer, we once again took a lengthy cross-country trip with many long stops. We were very grateful not to have moved to the Midwest because when we got there, they were being brutalized by extreme weather all winter and spring. We stayed about a week in Corbin with Riley and Mint, who at this point had gotten heavily involved in the Comicsgate drama surrounding the feuds that they and many others had brewed up with Eric July, and they had become friends with Ethan Van Sciver, so they were very enthusiastic about getting us involved in the independent comics scene. This is when I conceptualized and began precursor work on Prickly, a space western about a hulking cactus man built out of ideas that I thought Mint Salad would be good at realizing visually. I started the storyboard for the first issue there, and I finished it over the next month, after we moved into the Frog at my parents' house, and Bird returned to regular employment. Right now, Prickly is pretty much just waiting on Mint to conclude her daily vlog series in October and then go full-time into working on comics. Now, from that point, our intent had pretty much just been to lay low at my parents' house, make more money, and eventually get ourselves into a place. But we have been struggling to hold on to money, and the cost of living just keeps going up in Virginia. We took a trip to C2E2 at one point, originally intending to meet EVS, but he got banned for the con for dumb reasons, so we turned it into more of a camping trip instead. When we went there, Mint Salad had gotten heavily into the vertical streaming meta and was making more money than ever before over just a couple of weeks, which inspired me to get into the live streaming meta as well. And because I quickly found that I could make faster money streaming than I've ever been able to make otherwise, I've made streaming the primary focus of my career ever since then, hoping to rake in enough money to get us into our own place as soon as possible. However, my schedule has been kind of broken by the fact that I can only record at home during certain windows of the day, and I've been agonizing constantly about what other projects that I'm always toiling at in the background will be the one to take me to another level as a content creator. But all of that stands to change soon, as my dad has offered to help get us into a place as soon as possible and hopefully leave me with the space to go much harder on realizing my content, or just get a job if it doesn't work out. My desire to meet and to work with people in person remains, but over time I have come to realize that it's harder for me to do professional work in a group setting than it is to simply flow into ideas as a product of hanging out with people. My favorite environment to be in is a convention environment, and I have long desired to get into a career as a convention panelist, but I've always struggled with developing panel ideas that will be equally interesting for myself and for the audience, and which aren't dependent on my internet clout to draw attention to them, like all the panels I've done before. I like streaming because it puts me in more direct contact with the audience, but it takes me a lot of mental energy to do it all the time, and it has gotten harder for me to justify emotionally anytime I don't make as much money or when I only get paid to do relatively banal things like watch shows. I would like to be better known for my creative content, but my music tends to be somewhat difficult to comprehend for a lot of listeners, and I lack the concentration to realize the long-form writing projects to the degree that captivate an audience and gives them faith that I will see them through to the end. My favorite projects that have come out over the last 4 years are as follows. The We Watch Anime podcast, which released through most of 2023, which also chronicled all of our travels around the country on top of our opinions about currently airing anime, and it created the relationship with our core audience that has kind of dovetailed into my streaming career. The Void Gazers variety show and Void Chasers documentary series that we did towards the end of 2020 and start of 2021 were a ton of fun to make and are the best glimpse that you can get into what my crew was doing around that time in late 2020 and 2021. Around then is also when I released Baroness Phantom, The Witch in Gold, and Boogie Pop Duo, which were my first self-produced albums that I'm actually kind of proud of. And there was some great stuff on Skip the Hate and Hurricane Season, which were collaborative projects I did with Riley. And also some of the stuff we did with Sucker Punch was really good. My Perfect Rapper LP and Traveling Cemetery were decent albums, although Rogue Alien Pet is easily my favorite album that I've made so far, besides the one that I have nearly finished working on over the past few months, Ridiculously Adequate Performance. The song by Daybreak is out, and I've played a bunch of the songs on streams. Baby Stabber, which I released towards the end of 2022, is one of my favorite things I've ever made and a truly timeless short horror piece. Actually, it was for Halloween specifically. Anime Alphabet, which started in 2021 and continued up through 2022. I hope to eventually continue. It is the very best anime content I think I've ever made, and I'm also really happy with some of my return videos from early 2022, like We Have Forgotten Love, Crunchyroll Didn't Stop, and Why Trans People Love Toho, my Diddy Kong Racing retrospective, my very short-lived Elden Ring series, and a series of isekai videos that damn nearly revived my channel before all of the copyright nonsense happened, as well as the first part of what might have been an epic breakdown of that horrible live-action Bebop adaptation had I ever finished it. I'm proud of all my transgender anime coverage and also of the first episodes of my fledgling Comments on Comments podcast, which started just this year, reacting to the resurgence of Maddox. I love the full playthrough of The Legend of Zelda that I fully edited on the Bird Friends Play channel that was recorded in late 2021 and released in late 2022. And I also love every picnic adventure video because all of them represent the most memorable days of my life. And all the live streams from that channel. I have tons and tons of unedited picnic adventure footage. I've been working on a film that will be the first in I want to continue it as a film series, and so the first one is about our adventure in 2023, mostly focused on when we finished the job and we're on our way back, because we visited so many parks in that whole period of time. Like basically anything we visited in between jobs in 2023 is the main focus of this movie that I'm working on. It'll be called USA My Backyard. Besides all of that, a lot of my best work has been on yet unreleased or incomplete projects like Bargain Witch, the book Good People, videos like the 50 pages I've written on Perfect Blue or Shantae, and other things that I've mentioned publicly over the years but have yet to show anything for the effort. I've also got some very new projects like Sunops, whose first chapter I am still retooling as an audiobook, or my weekly playthrough of Umineko no Naku Koro ni, where I perform all of the voices, which has now gone on for about a month. I'm also happy with some of the topical segments of my live streams that have become great clips, and I'm happy with the culture of clipping my content and people like That One Lucario fan, Trixie Clipsy, who have been doing a lot to try to help my live stream show pick up more steam. I really loved my coverage of the Kendrick versus Drake beef, my hilarious reactions to the Lily Orchard or James Somerton, That Anime Snob videos, and stuff, all the mimetic stuff I've been doing on the streams. My attacks on straight culture, my 2028 presidential campaign, making gay jokes about the quartering, telling the Chris Chan medallion story after my cousin's suicide. That was a whole crazy thing that went down. There's a lot of deep lore. Overall, I've created a preposterous amount of content in the last 4 years, just like I always do. But since this was the period of time where that content has received far fewer views than it did on average in the 4 years prior, it is very likely that unless you're one of the handful of people that I can name personally that might have seen everything I made public in that time frame, you probably haven't seen much of it. Hell, I probably don't even remember a bunch of shit that I forgot to mention, like the creation of rare characters like Queermo or the Literal Thinker, or 22 pages I apparently wrote about Metroid at some point. This must have been around when Metroid Prime Remastered came out, I guess. If I try to recall everything, I'm going to start losing track of what actually came out and what didn't. So I'll leave the rest for you to explore on your own, but I hope this helped. Thanks again for watching. Use my link tree to find all of my stuff. And never forget to always remember Trixie forever. Oh, no, Trixie for president, 2028. Yeah!